Mary, thanks so much for that incredible introduction. So excited to be here and so thrilled that Chicago Booth gave me an opportunity to be reunited with Rhonda.
Yes, I've been looking forward to this. It's an opportunity to have a discussion about something we both feel passionately about, and we get to reunite. So, yes. Pleasure. Well, maybe we could just start by your sharing a little bit about your current work at UBS. Were you always interested in financial inclusion? And if so, how did you get on this path?
Yeah, I was, even though I didn't realize it. So maybe we should step back and think about what the definition of financial inclusion is, just a level set for everyone. Financial inclusion is defined really as access to useful and affordable products that serve the needs of all people. Right, so you have those two twin goals of equitable access and tailored solutions put together. And I've always been involved in that space. When I started out my career, I was focused on really providing equity compensation to all employees, right? Because I wanted all employees to feel like owners. And that, for me, was sort of my first foray into financial inclusion on the access side. After Booth, when I became an attorney and I worked as a lawyer, it was about making sure that everyone had the same position in front of the government when it came to tax services and tax representation. So no matter whether it's been advising entrepreneurs on how to make everyone an owner in their company, or advising companies and individuals about how they can each be treated equitably in front of the government, I've always been focused on that. However, this unique focus on wealth really started for me about, I want to say 8 years ago. I went into wealth management with this thinking of making sure that I could take what the solutions and services that were happening for the wealthiest individuals and make them more accessible to everyone. Because I think good news should be spread, right? So that is really what I started doing. But then I noticed when I was working with families who had what I would call sudden wealth, that the financial system wasn't really set up to serve them, or with families who were building their wealth and working towards generational wealth. The financial system wasn't set up to meet them where they were. And so that's when I had a career change about 3 years ago, when I said, you know what, I want to tackle these problems at scale. And so luckily UBS agreed and allowed me to step back from my role as a banker and an advisor to high net worth and ultra high net worth families and go about building a scalable solution on how we can change the financial industry to work better for all of us.
I love that.
Yeah. So I have really thought about, I'm thinking about helping people leverage their financial power, and I know that's part of what I do, but your work is similarly about that, if I'm not mistaken, about helping students really find their voice and find their footing and find their power. What's so transformational for you about the power of debate? What makes it such an essential skill?
It's inspiring. It's been very inspiring for me. I never debated. And so I entered this space from a position of learning, admiration, frankly. And one of the things I noted very early on is when I was on the corporate side of things, I would have been salivating at this talent. And so first off, debaters are highly inquisitive. They do tons of research. They're adept at doing tons of research. They possess the critical thinking skill that gets further developed in debate in a way that no other high school activity, I think, provides for them. And so you take that as sort of the starting point, and then there are continuing opportunities to evolve in communication and collaboration, like all of the skills that we value for a 21st century workforce. And then the students have the ability to consider multiple sides of an issue. And I think that's really important, particularly when you consider where we are today as a society. And so debaters are incredibly adept at analyzing the issues from multiple viewpoints, and they're excellent at problem solving. And so it's just been a wonderful opportunity to get to see it up close and personally, and then also continue to provide opportunities for students even beyond their high school debate careers.
I love how you mentioned debate being sort of rooted in empathy, right at its core. Even though you may not necessarily agree with the other side of an issue, or even the third side of an issue, because I think it's somewhat of a fallacy to think that issues have two sides.
Yes.
That it's rooted in empathy. But talk a little bit more about how you're working with your debaters beyond high school. What sort of through line and connection point do you see for alumni of the program?
That's an excellent point. One of the things I realized when I entered this space, we were very focused on success in high school, success in debate that would impact their high school careers. And we understood that students who debated were much more likely to go to college and graduate college than their non-debating peers. However, there's sort of a lost touch point. We didn't necessarily know where students ended up. We didn't necessarily provide or pursue a concerted effort to help them excel beyond their debate careers. And so that's been a lot of fun for me, actually. We've been more focused on it lately as an organization. And now we have instituted a new program where we provide a fellowship. It's an opportunity for our alumni to first earn, which is an issue. A number of students who have different financial backgrounds are unable to accept a non-paying internship. And so that's something I think employers forget about. And so as you think about diversifying your workforce, consider all those sorts of barriers to entry in terms of gaining meaningful work experience. So we instituted a fellows program 3 years ago. We currently are working on a community that we built on LinkedIn, and so we have a debate community, and employers that we know in our networks are invited to share opportunities, and so we spread those around, and it's just the beginning. So there's lots of opportunity for us to grow, and thankfully our board is very supportive, and the debate community, as you probably know, is fairly rich and connected, rich in spirit and depth, and connected and highly supportive of one another. And so we are excited to leverage that to provide even more benefit to the students that we serve.
Yes, and I remember us talking about this because unbeknownst to each other, there's a connection to us through the debate league, right? Because I'm a former high school debater.
I had no idea.
College debater, and actually was involved in the New York chapter of your organization with an amazing mentor that I had, Will Baker, who was involved in, and debate has been really critical to my life. It's part of the reason I became a lawyer. So, yeah.
Yeah, there's a saying that if you meet a debater, they'll tell you debate changed their life. And so far, 1,000% true for every debater that I meet. It's true. It's a life-changing opportunity.
Yeah, it truly is.
So maybe thinking now about the work that you do, what are some of the sobering facts about wealth or financial freedom when it comes to marginalized communities?
Right, I think that it's really important to think through, as we think about with hope and optimism about what the future holds for the next generation of leaders through debate. I think the thing that motivates me is that there's still so much work to do, right? The racial wealth gap is still alive and well when we think about financial freedom. For example, what we see is that 84% of the wealth in the United States is held by white Americans, even though they represent about 60% of the population. And black Americans hold about 4% of the wealth, even though they represent roughly 13% of the population. So when you step back and take that in, that is vast. It's a lot of ground to make up when you think about equity and building equitable solutions or parity within holding wealth in the United States. The other thing is that when you take a look at systems of financial exclusion that have existed over time, you see the legacies of that even now. when you look at investors of color who are not necessarily fully participating in the stock market, when you think about the returns that the market has had, even though now when we log in and look at our accounts, we're like, oh my goodness. But when you look at over time, if you had been invested in the market over the last 10, 20 years, that would have been the fastest way to change your circumstances around wealth. However, what we see is that a quarter of African Americans and Hispanic Americans are actually invested in the market. Instead, what you see is investment in more tangible assets. And there's nothing wrong with that, but really focused on things. I mean, as my grandmother would like to say, I like to ride by my money, right? So housing, real estate, things like that. But I think it's really sort of recognizing that there's still a lot of work to do to have people realize that there are so many other levers that you can pull in terms of your wealth building journey.
Incredible.
Yeah. And I think it's something that we should continue to think about. And speaking of wealth journeys and really career journeys, we saw an incredible one happen recently with newly appointed Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. I think it means a lot to me personally as a lawyer, as a Black woman lawyer. I'd love to hear from you what this meant to your students. If you could give us some examples of the reactions that your students had to that, and even for the urban debate leagues.
You know, for all of us, myself included, it's always powerful when you see yourself. And so for me, as a Black woman, I hadn't considered that I wasn't seeing myself at the U.S. Supreme Court. And so to see her ascend to that level certainly creates a pride, but also a knowing that there is, in fact, representation. And so that's just for me on a deeply personal level. For the students, though, I mean, there's cheering, there is pride, there is absolute pride, and that's, you know, considering her, you know, as an African American woman in this position, considering her as an African American woman who debated in this position has been even more astounding, and I think makes her so much more relatable and makes her success more tangible as, you know, someone who did the same thing that I'm doing now. And not just that, I think we'd be hard pressed to find an interview or an interview, a recording, or an article where Justice Brown Jackson does not mention debate in her story, you know, in her origin story. She talks about it all the time, and I think that's a distinction as well. And she points to how this is very much a part of her fiber. It's very much a reason for her success as a human, and certainly her career trajectory. She credits debate with all that she has accomplished, and I think that's not different than any other debater, yourself and others. And so I think that for one, that's what it means for the students, and for debate leagues that exist in 22 cities around the country. It highlights debate as an activity, and so it's not often that gets mentioned in the news, and so it becomes an excellent, I guess, promotional tool, and then also a recruitment tool, because the next Ketanji Brown Jacksons are paying attention and hopefully becoming more intrigued about the activity.
Did you see that? Did you see an influx of parents calling and saying, look, we want to get our kids involved in debate?
We hear about that, or in cases where there are debate teams, then there's an interest in increasing it. We've had a school district reach out that's interested in weaving debate into its programming, and I've seen that at the national level, at least a few more inquiries about how do we start a debate team, or we want to bring urban debate to our community. How do we go about doing that? And so those are really exciting conversations to have.
Fantastic.
And what about for you? In what ways have you seen things improving? In what ways have you seen companies try to remedy the realities of the lack of diversity and inclusion?
So I've seen companies make enormous strides, and I think we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge the acceleration that happened in the wake of the murder of George Floyd.
Yeah.
Right? So I think you saw companies all across all industries take it to heart, and you saw a lot of commitments, but even more than that, you saw action, which I think is meaningful. You saw actual dollars being allocated to really building a more inclusive society. And then when I take a step back and I look at the corporate landscape, I think historically, inclusion has been something that has been more driven from the philanthropy or the community affairs side of the house. And I think that is amazing as one building block. But I think one of the things that it does not recognize is that people of color are clients, they're consumers, they're individuals who have wealth, they're individuals who have enormous power. And so what you started to see now is companies really shift and look at product inclusion, look at services inclusion. Now, for example, you can go in to any of the retailers and you see, products that are meant for, let's just face it, people with my hair type, right? You can see that now, and I don't have to, plan in advance before I go into a store. And I think that that's one of the real tangible ways that I've seen it. I think one of the other ways that I've seen it is really allies starting to lean in heavily and educate themselves around what it takes to have meaningful support at work. And I think I've seen that happen more and more. So I think those two things have been really just a resurgence that I've been so optimistic to see. And I think the third thing that I've seen companies do more is move beyond representation to inclusion, right? It's not just enough to have sort of diverse employees in your organization if they don't have a seat at the table, if they don't have P&L where they can make decisions, if their opinions aren't given light and their voices aren't given full freight or weight, then you still haven't gone far enough. And what I saw was a shift, and that companies really stopped, listened, and actioned. And that's been really wonderful, I think, to hear from companies all around across industries as I talk to my colleagues across.
I want to touch on something. You mentioned having a seat at the table, and I wonder if you would expound upon that, because I know for myself personally, perhaps for you, there's a difference between having a seat at the table and being included and valued at that table. And so what might you have to share about that?
Yeah, so I can speak about it. I think that it's a transformation that happened for me in my career, right? There was always something, particularly around Black History Month, where you would see people come to you and ask around what kind of programming should we put on, and you were heard. But now the conversation is shifting and changing. For me, I'm being asked about consumer preferences, which I think is so very different in the business that I've built, which I'm so thrilled about. We're leveraging those client insights to develop new products and new solutions. I have a P&L. Right? Whereas before you would be contributing and you would contribute an idea and you wouldn't necessarily know where it would go in the ether. Now, not only can I share ideas, but I can actually have the wherewithal to implement them. And what's been really transformational for me is I have direct access to the senior executives of my company. And I cannot tell you how critical that is. Not only access to the senior executives, but also to the managers who are on the ground. Because if you can have all of the executive support in the world, but if your managers on the ground are not aligned, you have great ideas, but no action or implementation that anyone can see. So I think for me, being able to operate and have access at all levels of the company has been the real shift that I've seen.
That's really important. And I think for me, until I got that level of access, I didn't understand what I was missing. Because when you get to hear the message from the person who created it, and then you get to be the voice that communicates that message or interprets it down the line, that is pretty special. And there's another piece to this. which is a learning and development that you get from having that access to the C-suite. I know I personally rely on or use just tools like in my editing of executive communications. You're laughing, but it's a real thing.
It is.
And I got it because I sat with the CEO and who actually marked up, very kindly, by the way, a presentation, and not just marked it up, but then communicated to me why this matters. And that's something you take throughout your career, and I would never have otherwise gotten that level of feedback to make me more effective in the message that I'm trying to deliver at such a high-level audience.
Right. No, I agree. I think that in terms of moving from having a voice to having voice, influence, and power, that is something, that transformation changes you. And moving from someone who's been marginalized or who comes from a community that has been marginalized, I think it makes you inherently a different leader, and a leader who listens to others, and a leader who sort of lifts as you climb. And I think that's really important. So a lot of the work that I do is about getting folks to realize that money matters, right? And that their voice matters. And we always say wealth is health, but the data, the studies are showing that that's true. How can we do a better job? We talked about having voice and having recognition and seeing that recognition in through line. How can we do a better job of recognizing sort of the smallest or most marginalized voices around us and amplifying them?
I think the first step is acknowledging that they exist. And we've seen that. As you mentioned, that business, retail perhaps, has done a different job of that level of inclusion. And I think for financial services especially, it matters that I walk in and I see someone who looks like me, that understands my story, my demands, the pressures perhaps that I have, not just for myself, but in some cases maybe for a family, or that I had to pay for college, that there was no family support for those kinds of things, and so that would understand my tracking, for lack of a different term, and have a level of empathy. And I think so much has been done in terms of diverse recruitment or recruiting diverse employees, but there's so much more that needs to happen, because as you mentioned, you've seen it in your business, that brings you different perspective. The product needs to anticipate the users of it, and without having inclusion, I'm not sure how you design a product that would be effective for someone or something that you don't know.
No, I think that's right. And I love what you said in that it's the responsibility of the organization.
It is.
Because so many times, and I'd love for you to speak on this, especially from a debate perspective, you have gifted advocates, but so much of the burden oftentimes is placed on individuals to be that shining light of diversity, when I think organizations can do so much more as well, too.
Advocacy is really important. I started my career as an engineer, went on to business, and now am in the nonprofit sector. And one of the things, this is not going to be familiar to you at all in financial services, as being the only woman in the room, or the only, certainly the only woman, perhaps also the only African American in the room, in ways that, quite frankly and simply, my voice was actually literally, marginalized in the room and making a point. And so because I had that experience really early on, I today make it a point when that happens, it always happens in a room, to direct the conversation back, or to point out that individual and say, hey, you had a question, right? Or Melinda's trying to make this point, let's hear her out. And so that's me from my position. And so imagine, company leadership paying attention, not just to voice, but also what I would call like airtime. And so the silence does not indicate that I have no opinion or that I have nothing to offer, it might be a sign of comfort or discomfort or exclusion. And so organizationally, we can do things about that. Leadership is the only one really to model that behavior of inclusion. I think mentorship is a great opportunity. I acknowledge early on in my career, I didn't know to seek out a mentor. And so there were a number of folks that were gracious enough to reach out for me and offer to me. And so I think for those that are in those positions, consider who you're mentoring. Today, I don't exclusively mentor young African American girls. I'm all about development of young people in general. And I happen to work in this space, but I don't shut the door on anybody else. And my mentees look different than me. My mentees look like the students that we serve at Noddle, and they don't look like the students that we serve. And I think organizationally, more can be done to be intentional about who gets access, who gets supported, who gets special projects. The person that doesn't ask for the special project is equally qualified, but perhaps does not know how to navigate the waters of positioning themselves for those unique opportunities.
Absolutely.
And then you've been an outspoken advocate of people holding financial firms accountable and asking questions about their inclusive practices. How do you recommend that people go about doing this, and how should they or could they begin that conversation?
You know what? I am probably the queen of uncomfortable conversations, I have
Perhaps.
to tell you, because I believe the discomfort that we feel, that's growth, right? And especially if you are in the seat of the client or the consumer, you deserve answers to your questions. And especially if you want to do business with someone with whom your values align. So I often start by encouraging, I have a couple things. I want clients to ask to see the company's diversity report and their DEI impact report, so they can see the makeup of the workforce, they can see the progression and of individuals of different backgrounds throughout that company. So I think that's the first thing that I ask on an overall level. I want folks to ask their advisor, their banker, whoever they might work with. I said DEI impact is critical. Then I want them to then ask, tell me what the business is doing to advance inclusion. I'd love for them to talk about, separate and apart from their philanthropic initiatives, how is it baked into the core of your business practices? And you'd be surprised, the scramble that tends to happen on the other side to prompt that conversation is critical. So I think that's the second piece. I think the third that I would feel quite comfortable asking and would encourage others to do the same, especially if I'm talking to someone who's going to manage my money, how many of your clients look like me? Or how many of your clients don't look like you? Just so that I have a really good gauge of how many clients that banker has worked with that might understand my situation, that might know my cultural upbringing. So I want to get a sense of how culturally empathetic the individual that I'm working with, how empathetic they are. So that for me is a really, really sort of big thing that I take a look at. And then I also try to have organizations line up their commitments to their delivery. So
what do you mean by that?
For example, I think a lot of companies are really great about doing headlines about commitments. And I'll just throw a number, 100 million to advance racial equity. And I always say, do a Google search, look at the commitments that the financial institution you're working with has made, and then go in and ask, how has the money been distributed? How have you used that money? Because to me, commitments require accountability on action. And you want to see, how is that $100 million dispersed? Did it go for the purpose in which it was intended? How did it impact the lives of individuals who were members of those communities? Did it actually move the needle on the gap? So I think that for me is a huge thing to really ask to see, if the commitment is more than just smoke and mirrors. And then finally, for me, I am curious about sort of the whole ecosystem of wealth being generated. So, which, for example, supplier diversity is something that's really meaningful for me. So I want to ask questions around how many diverse business owners are you working with to run your own business? How much money are you putting into the hands of other business owners that are diverse? And that, for me, is such a critical component, because to me, for a company to fulfill its financial inclusion commitment, it should be looking at the clients it serves. It should be looking at its employees. It should be looking at the communities in which it operates and the vendors that they do business with. So the questions I go through, and we just ran through them, are really looking at each quadrant to take a deeper look and sort of have people put up or shut up and show the numbers.
So I want to step back for a second. So you share these examples of things that I can ask as I'm meeting with a financial advisor or representative. So you're suggesting that I have the power as a client to do that. So I wonder if you could just share more about that feeling of empowerment, or differently, the feeling of disempowerment that exists in the community, and what opportunities exist to further educate and empower those who may not know that I can ask these questions.
Yeah, and I always say it's your money. It's your money, so it's your decision. And so that's sort of the baseline from which I operate. And I have worked with a lot of folks who have a feeling of gratitude sometimes when they get the mortgage for their home, not realizing that they could go to really any number of financial institutions and have a relationship. So I think the first thing that I tell people is to step back and realize that your money is valuable to the institutions that they're working with, and if not, you shouldn't be working with that institution. Right. So you are always in a position of power. With financial services institutions, the power is always with the client, because the client can always move assets. So you should feel very comfortable asking any and all questions. I feel like it's like dating, but it's your money.
Right.
So all of
like dating, only better.
Exactly. So you want to get all of those, uncomfortable questions, like, do you leave all the doors open? Do you pick up, like, all of the equivalent of those questions that you would find in choosing a partner, and choosing the person who's going to be with you through all of life's most critical moments. I think about financial advisors as they're your partner when you expand your family and you have a child. Who are you going to talk to? You're going to talk to your advisor. If you get married, you have an advisor. When you send someone off to college, you talk to your advisor about that. You're talking and sharing the most critical moments. It's like your chosen family. So you should be very comfortable asking any and all questions about that member, that chosen member of your family, because they're going to know all your business.
They are.
Comfortable with that. And in terms of resources to take a look at, there are a number of them. I always say, trust and sort of double check. So when someone, for example, gives you a rate for a mortgage, or you look at rates for cards, you say thank you very much, and then you go and you check with an outside source, something like a bankrate.com, and you take a look at, well, what's the actual lending? If you're getting ready to do a deposit right now, I was actually just having this conversation with a family member and saying, do you know rates are rising? And you could actually, the money that's sitting in a savings account, you could actually be earning more, having your money make money, because that's true wealth, when the earning potential is not from any exercise of labor that you have. It's literally the money that you've already earned is working on your behalf. And so every opportunity you have to do that, being vigilant and educated as much as you can be about that. And I will be forever grateful. I went to business school while I was working for Morningstar,
I remember.
mutual fund rating company, right?
Yeah.
And they were critical to my financial education. I will never forget, they're the ones who even prompted me to go to University of Chicago. They pulled me to the side and they said, look, you're incredibly smart. We want you to have a finance underpinning. And I went back and my eyes were opened to the possibilities of, wait a minute, I actually am in the driver's seat on every single one of these decisions. And education is key. And if your banker, your advisor isn't educating you, they're doing you a disservice, I believe, because that's the goal. The goal is that your advisor is supposed to be providing you with expert guidance so that you can ultimately make the final decision about what works best for you, your family, and your legacy.
One more follow-up question, if I may. Supplier diversity. Another term that I hear folks often talk about. What role does a financial institution play in promoting or ensuring more diversity of suppliers?
Sure, they play a role in a couple of different ways, but I'll talk about two. One is the way that they spend their own funds to run their business. And so when we think about supplier diversity, what that means is that there are businesses that have been certified as women or minority-owned businesses. They've gone through a certification process to verify, in fact, that their ownership is held by one or more individuals of that background. And what financial institutions, the amount of money they spend to continue to operate as a going concern, from everything from their technology vendors, who they use for security, both tech security and physical security, the lawyers that they use, the accountants that they use. All of those things are a focus around supplier diversity. On the flip side, and that's sort of the expense side of it. On the wealth creation side of it, with respect to supplier diversity, that financial institutions play a huge role. When you take a look at small business lending, in terms to those small businesses, the majority of minority-owned businesses are small businesses, and that lending is necessary. It's really can be what exists between risk and ruin, especially during the pandemic. We saw a huge decimation in businesses of color as a result of not having the liquidity that they needed to operate their business as a going concern. So business lending, other strategies for the formulation and the ongoing preservation of wealth for your business. When you take a look at money managers, making sure that, and those are the investment options that you pick on your platform, to know that the person who is actually allocating capital on your behalf could be a diverse fund manager. It's those kinds of opportunities that I think that banks have a real obligation to look at. So I always take a look at, through every chain the dollar flows.
It does.
We should be thinking about inclusion at every lens, because that's real product inclusion, not just on the client side, but through the whole ecosystem of wealth. It's really important to think about that. All right, so we have some questions from the audience.
Okay.
So we're in a round robin time. So
I
let's
love
get
it.
to this, and I think we should both talk about things as we see fit. So how do you advance D&I opportunities without disrupting growth of large and smaller businesses? How do you think about that?
I think about, it's an interesting question. And so I think about it as one does not preclude the other. And so I see diversity and inclusion as an enabler, frankly, of growth for large and small businesses. And so it's fascinating that sure, there are investments, financial investments that you could make, but frankly speaking, by adding just one new member of your team, not adding an additional headcount, but then hiring that individual in, you massively expand your capacity because you have the benefit of perspective. And that's just something that I feel really strongly about. Perspective and context, for me, are everything. And so as you are considering ways to either implement your strategy or reorganize or develop your strategy, it's really important to have that representation of someone who has different experiences than you, different thought processes than you, even for the two of us, so happen to be African American women, but between the two of us, I don't know, we've probably had 6 careers,
yes,
right?
That's true.
And so a fair amount to bring to any table. I will reach back in a heartbeat and pull out something from my engineering hat or business or nonprofit or my time in graduate school or what have you. And I think that's the benefit. And so it's not just ethnic diversity and inclusion. I had the benefit of taking a class a couple years during the pandemic. We did an online course and had my eyes opened because what we often don't consider is accessibility and this diversity and inclusion conversation. And forever, I will consider that in terms of design, speech, language that I use. And I was enriched by just that one tiny exposure of an individual who runs an organization that's more focused on accessibility and inclusion. So yes.
I think that's fantastic as we take a look at diversity being highly intersectional. And diversity isn't siloed. It isn't just one thing. And I think, and thanks for pointing out that a lot of folks think that diversity begins and ends with race and ethnicity, and it doesn't.
It doesn't.
It moves so beyond that to take a look at age, ability, gender, socioeconomic background, veteran status, you name it. Diversity is the richness of all of those things. I love what you said about they're not mutually exclusive, growth and diversity, not just from the representation piece. I mean, when I think of my own business, the creation of my own business was the understanding that there were, when we actually looked and counted, because there's a stereotype that people of color in particular, that there's not wealth in those communities. Probably the prevalence of the wealth gap is giving rise to that stereotype. But when we actually went and did the research, we identified, setting aside real estate, we're talking just about cash and liquid investments. There were 2 million individuals in the United States that had at least $1 million to invest. And that was a number.
And we're not investing.
And yes, and that was a number that blew away really us in the room, senior management. It was really a feeling that I had and the power of data to know that this was a market that we needed to take a look at, that was significant, sizable, and growing. We always think about in the financial services sector the future of wealth. And I think the reality is that we're looking at a nation that is becoming increasingly diverse on all facets. When you look at multicultural and millennials, 44% of millennials are racially and ethnically diverse. Roughly 25% of millennials identify as LGBTQIA+. Right? And when you take a look at the decisions that women millennials are making with respect to education, it's the most highly educated generation that we've seen. And in fact, women millennials are out earning college degrees more than their male counterparts by 6%.
Wow.
So we are seeing a sea change happening around this sort of future generations. And when you look at, there's a number all the finance people kind of like to throw out and live in fear of, $74 trillion are in motion from baby boomers, right, our parents, to millennials. $74 trillion. And if we want to remain relevant as a company, as an organization, we've got to get our house in order.
Right.
Because that millennial population and the Gen Zs and all the ones that come after it are vocal about what they want.
They are.
Highly committed to inclusion. Do not, frankly, you're already at a detriment because they don't want their parents' advisor. Right,
sure.
Because it's almost like a parent proxy.
Right.
So they don't want that.
I'm my own person.
Yes. So they are looking for diversity out of the gate, and that's something that's really critical. And then I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the growth of smaller businesses, because when you take a look at businesses that have only 1 or 2 employees, do you add so that it's impossible to have your business reflect the fabric of the U.S.
Right, of course. That's a good point.
A numbers issue, right? But I think what you do have is the ability, everyone has the capacity for cultural empathy, no matter your background. Everyone does. So I think when you look at your market and when you look at the board of advisors that you have advising you on your small business, making sure that that board of advisors is as broad as possible, making sure that you are really looking at the communities in which you do business to try and have as broad of a bandwidth as possible. It's not necessarily all about representation of the employees, it's about the communities in which you serve. And I think there are certain small businesses that do an amazing job of that, even though they have, one or two or less than 20 employers thinking about that.
That's an excellent point. I'm glad you thought to raise that. So another question from our audience. It felt like there was a lot of momentum in 2020, 2021, the D&I space, and then overall, societal emphasis fizzled out. What's your advice for allies on how to stay engaged post-George Floyd?
Oh, y'all are going to get me in trouble. All right. Let's talk about this. I mean, the reality of the situation is that there was a lot of what I call, how do I say it? I'll just say it, performative DE&I happening around those events. And those are when you get, the CEO up on main stage and they do the commitment and there's a huge event and you don't hear anything afterwards. But even for those organizations that have made meaningful commitments, you do see it waning. Yeah. And I think there were some in the DEI space who were pragmatic about that and were working as fast as they could to push as hard as they could, because I think whenever you have movement-based work, you have the possibility of there being some regression in the movement, but even though there's regression, there might still be progress. So a couple of things I have for allies to really think about as they think about sort of the waning, or what I would, not necessarily waning support, but the decline in visibility that you see around the support. I think the first thing I would say for allies is you have the ability to remain consistent, incredibly consistent. So the same things that you were doing in the wake of those events, the same things, right? The conversations that you were having with your peers that did not necessarily share the same backgrounds as you, the conversations you were having around diversity and inclusion with your DEI professionals, the conversations you were having at the executive suite. Continue those. Your consistency is what leads to longevity of those movements. I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing that I would take a look at is credibility. We talked before about how a lot of organizations kind of operate from DEI, from a philanthropic background, and sort of having DEI as something that's nice to have but separate from the business. And if that's the case, it's the first thing to get sacrificed in times of economic decline, which is what I think we're starting to see a bit of. So I think the second thing I would tell allies to really think about is really go out of your way to look for tangible ways to foster inclusion directly in the business, right? And making sure that you're measuring, because measurement is what holds us all accountable. Yeah. And I think that the lack of measurement is sometimes how commitments don't become realities for folks. So I think that would be the second thing that I would think about. And I think the third thing that I would really encourage allies to consider is there an opportunity to elevate one of the individuals that you might be supporting? Because sometimes some of the best ideas are already there, but they just need platform and agency in order to carry them out. So I think one of the things as allies we can think about doing are to creating space for ideation, right? Acknowledging, for example, okay, we've finished up the first wave of our strategy where we have worked on visibility and movement building. Now we're on wave 2, which is how do we build an enduring legacy? And it's noticing what shift needs to happen in order for that to occur. That work is really beyond any one individual. And so how do you continue to have those conversations and stay top of mind? And I think engaging the communities is really the first step. What do you think about that?
Your second point reminded me of one of the more intentional organizations that I worked for. First and only time, I think, in my career where inclusion was embedded in objectives, in my individual performance objectives. So you had effectiveness competencies. Did you do the thing? All right. Are you meeting, more technical objectives, or margins, or et cetera? Is the business sound? But then there's this other piece of like what you do, but how you do it. And so inclusion is something that I think doesn't cost anything. I'm sure it doesn't cost anything to add to objectives for, I think that was the first or second question that we got.
Yeah.
And what that means is now if I'm evaluated on my commitment to fostering an inclusive environment or an inclusive workplace, then perhaps I think differently about the way I engage with my colleagues who are different than me, who have different experiences than me, and perhaps even different interests. And so I think that's a gimme for everyone, to consider including that in your performance planning for your employees.
No, I think that's a great idea, and it reminds me of an organization earlier on in my career when they tied manager bonuses to in recruitment of diverse individuals.
Makes a difference, right?
Oh my goodness, you've never seen so many. The common refrain you hear is, "Oh, we can't find the talent." Talent was coming out of the woodwork, and it was so interesting how incentive alignment is really guiding behavior, right? Because oftentimes what you see is people are operating from fear of change. Right. And so if they're being held accountable at the end of the day for X number of revenue growth, any change that they haven't tried before, there's a sentiment of fear around that to know that it's going to backfire. But if you are incentivized to change and you're being held accountable to not only recruit, but I think this organization did even more. They were looking at retention numbers too.
That's important.
And looking at overall, they were looking at sort of the employee scores from the employee surveys just to make sure that not only did folks get there, but when they arrived, did they feel included? You saw that actually led to a second wave of managers doing all sorts of team building exercises and getting to know folks.
That creativity starts to flow.
Let me tell you, they keep on coming up with ideas to foster inclusion. And I love to see it. And I think that incentive alignment and accountability are really the fastest ways to ensure, as an ally, you can continue to keep the momentum going.
Awesome. I know we're running close on time here. We have another question that is for you, Melinda, and that is, do you have any advice on how to access seed funding for Black, BIPOC, or women-led startups?
Yes, I do. So it's so interesting. It's definitely, when you take a look at the venture capital world, there's something like, I think, 1.4% of all VC funding goes to Black startups, and equally small numbers for Hispanic-led startups, and paltry numbers for women-led startups. So I think my advice, I'll give an example. So one organization that I'm proud to say UBS just underwrote, and it was announced last night.
Perfect.
Is Black Innovation Alliance. It is a national organization. It is a cohort of about 90 ISOs, so 90, support organizations that are in service of Black founders, and they're really committed to what they're calling the decade of Black innovation. I know, it is amazing. And what these support organizations do is that they help you from beginning to end. So they're really looking at startup founders who are not only looking for resources and training, but also trying to figure out funding. So one of my pieces of advice would be to reach out to Black Innovation Alliance, because oftentimes what you see is that as a startup founder, you're basically trying to Google search your way into funding. And it is truly and highly networked, the VC world, and it's really about relationships and who you know. And so organizations like Black Innovation Alliance really do help move the needle in terms of matching up Black founders with opportunities. Another organization that comes to mind for women founders is All Raise. So All Raise is a national organization of female funders and founders, so women on both sides of the table. And it's actually a recurring theme that the more diversity you have on who's allocating capital,
Yes.
you see a corresponding diversity in who receives that capital. It's just the nature of networks, right? So what All Raise does is it is really taking the top female funders, right? Just the who's who of that space. And there are some incredible sort of founders of that organization, including those who have been on the Midas list, sort of like the amazing list of like the top investors, and connecting them to female founders. And not only do they have office hours, but there's funding opportunities that come out of that as well. So my advice for any startup founder who's really looking to make that next step is to really look for these national organizations, because someone's already done that legwork for you to try and build resources so that you can access them. There are incredible organizations. Another one that comes to mind is Luminary, which is out of New York City, founded by a former banker, so it's very close to my heart. And what they are focused on is not only do they provide co-working space, but they also provide resources support and support on fundraising. So there are a number of incredible organizations that are out there. Definitely visit the UBS website, which you can find more that exists, because it's a space that we're really passionate about.
Thank you for sharing those resources. Boy, does an hour move quickly. So we are approaching the conclusion of our program today. Any final thoughts you want to share?
I think that what I would say is that inclusion is a never-ending journey, so the work is not done. So there's never going to be a point at which you can pack up and go home, and that is the amazing opportunity of it. And you don't have to be on the journey alone. I encourage anyone who is watching, if they have questions or want to trade notes or talk more about any of the topics that we've had, reach out. I'm very easy to find. I'm on LinkedIn. My work email is all over the place, but please do reach out and follow up if there are questions. I'm here and happy to help.
I love that. Inclusion is a journey.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any final thoughts from you?
I would just say representation does matter, and consider how you're hiring and where, and also consider the developmental opportunities you're providing for young people. There's so many talented young people that are not reached through the more traditional routes from an institutional perspective. And so definitely connect with organizations like ours, or others, and certainly don't forget about the colleges and universities and the HBCU circuit as well. It's an excellent; those are all excellent ways to access diverse talent, and there are thousands of organizations like mine that exist and focus solely on supporting the development of young people who happen to go to underserved schools and live in communities.
I appreciate that. So when you're really working with diverse talent, you've got to start early.
Yes.
The earlier the better.
And I too am accessible via LinkedIn as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for this conversation.
It's a pleasure.
It's always fun. It's always fun. And thanks to Chicago Booth for the opportunity for us to get together. Thank you so much. And I think we're set.
That's it. Thanks, guys.